Welcome back to the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. Please review and subscribe to the Groundless Ground podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, YouTube, radio.com, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and of course find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? Jeremy Lent's new book, The Web of Meaning, offers a coherent worldview of deep interconnectedness by integrating ancient Taoist and Buddhist views of humanness and awakening with a modern, scientific, conceptually-oriented view of human capacity. We discuss deep intelligence, wise action, how to expand collective concern to include all humans, our animal and plant brothers and sisters, and our planet. Jeremy makes the case for reigniting lost ethical values that can shift the disconnection that has led humanity to the brink of ecological and societal destruction. Our practical and philosophical dialogue moved me at the core of my being. May it be an inspiration for shift in everyone who hears this episode. Jeremy Lent, you are not only back for a second time, you're now author and integrator. I think you're the only integrator in the whole world.
Well, it's certainly an unusual title to choose for oneself. I would agree with that. And actually, to be honest, when I put it on my website a while back, it was because I was trying to figure out what it is that I do. There's more than just being an author. What I'm trying to put out into the world is this recognition that we have such separations in our specialties. This doesn't talk to that, doesn't talk to that. And part of my very theme of everything I'm putting out there is the integration of all different aspects of our human experience. So I figured, why not call myself that?
I love it. And it is so in line with your new book, which is finally out for everybody to read. I'm very excited. It's called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. You only need to read the title to get the whole intention toward here we are. We are not in a good place. Let's revision this whole thing and go to a place that will actually work.
Yes, I think that's right. And as you were talking, something about the title occurred to me that I haven't thought too much about, honestly, but maybe something about the way you were emphasizing it is this realizing one only needs to find one's place in the universe if one's lost one's place in the universe, which then raises the implication, well, how did we lose our place in the universe? And I guess another question one could ask is, well, did we ever know our place in the universe to begin with? These are some of the questions that get explored in the book.
Yes. You've been very specific in this book. You have decided to answer exactly those questions. I need to add another question. How come so many humans have no idea that they've lost their place in the universe?
Maybe we can also look at that in a different way and say, well, do they maybe feel that they have lost their place in the universe? But maybe the question is, how come so many humans are unwilling to recognize that they have lost their place in the universe? Because I think a lot of the time the feeling tone is there, the dukkha is there, that sense of something's not right. But because it's so not right, people don't want to face that and look at it.
So what you've tried to do in this book and succeeded in doing, I would say, is you've offered what you call, and I agree, is a coherent worldview that is steeped in deep interconnectedness. You take the tack that this arises from an integration of an ancient Taoist and some Buddhism views of humanness and a modern conceptually oriented view of humanness. And this is the first maybe 3 chapters of the book focused on this.
Yes, the first 3 chapters look at this question, who am I?
So what do an ancient Taoist view of humanness and a modern conceptually oriented view of humanness share, and where do they diverge?
What they share, in contrast to our kind of mainstream dominant view of humanness, is a sense, again, of that deep connectedness within ourselves, connectedness with others around us, and connectedness with all of life on Earth. If we just kind of start from a moment and what our modern worldview tells us, The thing about a worldview is that we all live with that worldview and make assumptions based on it, but it's not obvious. It's a little bit like fish swimming in water, that they don't realize they're in water unless maybe somebody lifts them out of the water and they go, oh, what's wrong? And similarly with our worldview. So our modern worldview basically tells us fundamentally humans are separate from nature, that our very identity is what makes us separate from nature. The whole Descartes, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, almost as saying like our thinking faculty is what actually is our existence. Everything else is meaningless. And it's not surprising that people like Descartes looked at non-humans as being machines. That's why he was willing to vivisect animals, saying, if they make squeaky noises, it's just like a machine. Don't worry, they don't actually have feelings like humans do. So there was a sense of our identity being in our cognitive thinking faculty, being totally separate from the rest of nature, and of course being superior to that machine that is nature, and therefore the sense that all of nature exists just for humans to exploit. So those are the fundamental ways in which early traditions and then modern science says actually every one of those things are wrong. What early traditions say, what indigenous traditions all around the world say, no matter whether they're in the Arctic or in the jungle or anywhere, they all share the same fundamental recognition that all of nature is family. Every living being is related. And this is something that, of course, evolutionary biology has validated in the last couple of decades, looking at our shared DNA. We all come from a common ancestor. In fact, we share about something like 43% of our DNA with a banana. There's so much of our sentient being that we share with other sentients around us. But then again, beyond indigenous wisdom, Buddhism, of course, as you all know, focuses so much on the interrelationship between things and the recognition that there is no fixed identity, that that's just something that we construct. Taoism similarly recognizes something very powerful, recognizes this notion that humans have what they call yu-wei and wu-wei. And wu-wei is like this kind of effortless way of being, like all nature does its thing. But humans have yu-wei, which is like a sort of conceptual consciousness, this way of separating ourselves from things and trying to direct them. And it's that yu-wei that Descartes considered was the only thing that makes humans human. So if you put all of these ideas together, what we begin to realize is that actually as humans, we have both a conceptual and an animate consciousness, that we are part of nature, we are part of life, as well as having a reflective and self-conscious faculty. And it's the integration of those two things that leads us to the possibility of a different way of relating to ourselves and to the rest of life around us.
So you actually describe this as a split consciousness. And you talk about an internal relationality between the minimal or embodied sense of I, my beingness, I'm here in a chair. That's
Right.
a very minimal sense of I, and this self narrative of who I tell myself I am.
Awareness of ourselves as separate selves is really something that arose in humans through the evolution to a greater extent than other mammals around us of the prefrontal cortex. And it's the same faculty that allows things like symbolic thinking. It's the same faculty that allows language, and the faculty that allows us to basically do all of the things that our civilization has manifested. Of course, there's many bad things about what our civilization has manifested, but I don't want to gloss over that is our very humanity in that interaction between those two layers. And it's something to absolutely be celebrated. It's not just a matter of separation in the sense that language is one of the greatest gifts to communication, of course, and to sharing our experiences with others around us, as well as developing technology and everything else that means. I want to recognize the profound importance and centrality of that faculty of self-reflection in humans. But then the point is, for humans in general, as part of the human condition, to then move to places of dukkha arising from that. But it's also as different cultures have developed and as our society has become so much more oriented around that total obsessive focus on just that faculty, Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, that has led to an imbalance. We want to bring it back into balance, not because one is good and one's bad, but because we're out of balance right now between the two.
This is really interesting because let's clarify this point further. Prior to us starting to talk about aspects of the human mind, we actually agreed that there is a way in which the ancient views and the scientific principles upon which much of the way we understand our world is also wise, that there is some shared wisdom there. Yes?
Right. Yes.
Great. So for me, the aspects of mind, that beautiful intellectual curiosity and capacity to calculate, theorize, and then hypothesize, and then actually prove, all those functions, they are not the problem. They are part of the solution.
There's not something like fundamentally wrong with the human condition. There's not something about humans that makes us bad or that is bad about us. But our society has taken certain elements of human cognition, and by creating these imbalances, by just focusing so much attention and through enculturing people from one generation to the next, making them so unbalanced in their sense of identity that it's led to many of the problems that we're facing right now, both in terms of our society as well as individual well-being.
Are we agreeing here that the separatism is not necessarily an outcome of the scientific worldview in and of itself?
Not in and of itself. I personally see it as a layered kind of accumulation, because when we look at the Taoist theory of civilization, if you will, and if we just take a moment to look at what the Taoists said, they basically said a long time ago, all humans were in wu wei, we're in total flow, and we're one with each other and one with all of nature, and everything was in harmony. But then they said, wise sages came with all their language and their ideas and their civilization, and started teaching people to carve the wood into particular tools and things like that. And then all this stuff happened that separated humans from the rest of nature. And that was this yu wei, this kind of purposive activity rather than wu wei, which is like effortless activity. And that's what went wrong with the human experience. So that's the Taoist perception. Now, somebody might look at that and say, wait a minute, that's not exactly wrong. That's civilization. Because they would even talk about in terms of the yu-wei consciousness as things like trying to use a pump to push water uphill, which is, of course, exactly what we do in our civilization. But so I think that there's a key thing there, because there is something in the human ability to have symbolic thought, to have a sense of a separate self, to have theory of mind, recognize that each of us is people that other people can see and begin to be aware of ourselves. It's something that creates what in cognitive linguistics, and I talk about this in the book, creates the sense of an I relating to the self. So when I say something like, oh God, I'm ashamed of myself, there's a split identity taking place right there. There's these two parts of me. There's some part that says I am making a judgment about myself and I'm ashamed of myself, or I'm proud of myself. It can be either way, but there's this separation. George Lakoff does a great job in actually looking at the ways in which we use language in that way. Again, we have to be careful about the definitions of these words, I and self, which can mean 1,000 different things, fundamentally different to different traditions or different people. But just in terms of the way regular language works, we recognize what that means and how there's a kind of a split there. That's what the Taoists understood. When Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, he was saying there's only the I, and the self, we don't even recognize its existence. What the Taoists lead towards, and what other traditions, and I think Buddhism does actually more to carry us on that path, is this possibility of reharmonizing within the field of consciousness between those two layers of identity and recognizing the true human organism to be actually something very different than anything that's fixed, to be more like a set of harmonic fractal flows between different layers of consciousness and even between different layers of interactivity within the self and with the rest of life outside the membrane, if you will, of our self-awareness.
Yes, of course. And that would be both emptiness and interdependence in the Buddhist literature.
Right.
This is the way that they conceptualize what you've just said.
Exactly. And something that I find quite interesting is this debate that took place around early Neo-Confucian times in Song Dynasty China, when Buddhism had spread to become quite predominant in Chinese culture by that time, from India originally. You had people who were Confucians pushing back against the influence of Buddhism. And there were some people who, in trying to critique Buddhism, would talk about what Buddhists say there is no such thing as the self. And they talk about this concept of emptiness. But I look at the world and I see it filled with this nonstop flowing of life just showing itself in all these different layers. Whatever the Buddhists say about emptiness, they simply can't stop life from doing its total flow of unfolding from one moment to the next. The reason I find that so interesting is because I would consider those two to just be different tonal qualities that at the deepest layers are actually referring to the same ultimate experience of that kind of recognition of allowing the dissolution of these barriers that separate things in our field of consciousness.
Well, it's interesting, as you know, Buddhism has had many different guises, many different ways of thinking about the mind, self. The historical Buddha was a separatist because he had this awakening to the baselessness of any solid, self existing nature for anything. And because prior to his awakening under the Bodhi tree, he basically did 6 years of the ascetic practices that were popular in the yogic tradition of the time. So he already was kind of in this milieu of the problem really is in your embodied existence as a desiring being. So you really need to get rid of that thing in order to experience this other thing. And that is a separatist view. It's not the same separatist view we have as modern people, but it is a similarly separatist view. And it's interesting how the Mahayana, like the Neo-Confucianists, came around in the first century and basically said, that doesn't work for most people, actually, because they have a body, they have lives, and we have to find a way to describe emptiness that includes everything, that is inclusive of all phenomena and the coming and going of all phenomena, and the fact that there's two natures. There's this existence, which you can't refute, and then there's this ultimate thing, which is beyond. That could be a separatist view. So it's kind of like even these traditions have gone through this interesting experience of dealing with subject-object dualism and how you integrate a basic human feeling of I'm inside and everything else is outside.
Yes. Something that I found incredibly helpful in my own investigations over the years, I write about it to some degree in the book. When these Neo-Confucians that I've mentioned, when they were trying to refute Buddhism, because Buddhism was so much embedded in the culture, they ended up creating what I find to be an incredibly helpful and rich synthesis, if you will, of both Buddhism and Taoism and traditional Confucianism. And just to touch on this, because it relates to what you were saying about the sort of emptiness and the everything's sort of somehow veering towards dualism in one form or other in that sense. What the new Neo-Confucians came up with is this concept of everything in the cosmos being comprised of Li and Qi. And most people are probably familiar with Qi, if we try to translate that into modern scientific terms, of matter and or energy. Because as Einstein pointed out, E equals mc squared, energy and matter are all related to each other. They're not fundamentally separate. So we can think of Qi as any kind of matter or energy, but the great Neo-Confucian insight, which actually came from Huayan Buddhism, is this notion of Li. And Li we can translate as something like principles of connection between things, or the organizing principles between things. So their sense is that Qi can't exist unless it is actually organized in some way or other. And the way in which it's organized is what refers to that Li. If it's organized in a dense way, Qi can be something like the earth or a mountainside. If it's organized in a very light way, Qi can be something that you might even consider like spirit. But the whole point is that everything requires those organizing principles. If you start to then look at what that implies for how you understand the cosmos, all kinds of ethical, cosmological, and ontological implications arise from that. This is where some of this integration between science and traditional wisdom arises in the book, because we see in modern sciences of connectivity, complexity science, systems thinking, these are sciences focusing on the Li, essentially focusing on the principles by which things connect. It's my proposition, and something I unfold in the book, that as we in the modern world, as scientists, are beginning to realize that we have to look in those connections between things to try to get a sense, a much deeper, more greater understanding of the cosmos and our identity, we can learn a lot from these Neo-Confucians and others who spent generations exploring exactly what it means to live in a universe that was defined by Qi and Li.
For instance, climate science is a great example of the integration. Climate science is continually looking at the relationships. It's continually looking at how things impact each other, which of course requires complexity theory as well as systems theory. Maybe you could say a little more so listeners can really get a sense of why Li and Qi may sound foreign, but how naturalistic they are in our science lexicon these days.
Well, that's right. There are so many sciences now, climate science is one of them, that actually exist in terms of studying the ways in which things connect. A lot of people are familiar with fractals. Yeah, fractals are basically patterns that repeat themselves roughly, not exactly, but the principles of the patterns repeat themselves at different scales in any kind of system. And it turns out that virtually every living system is comprised of fractality, and they appear in any system that is self-organized. And self-organization turns out to be a fundamental principle of life itself. And when biologists try to look at what is it that really defines life, principles of self-organization become essential. And those principles are really, we're looking at the Li. We're just simply using more modern scientific terms and using mathematical, rigorous methods to explore what the Neo-Confucians had spent many generations exploring themselves.
Yes. This is the great example of how we don't have to change that much in the way we understand things at an informational level. I still feel it's the personal level that people have so much trouble with because we have these modern identities that are so moved away in identification with anything other than me or the small circle of people I care about, the group of people that believe the thing I believe. We've taken
Yes.
tribalism to an extremity.
I think you are so right about that. And so much of it comes down to identity and the sense of fixed identity. Much of where I sort of go in the book is to really invite the reader to explore the sense of actually transforming a sense of identity to something much more extensive as a result of focusing on the Li rather than the Qi. To begin with, I'll just share one example, which is so simple yet incredibly powerful. I invite you to just think for a moment of a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. And then you look at that picture and you know that's you, right? But then we get to realize that actually there's not a single molecule that was in that little kid that is in you now. Like most of our cells are already different, but even those few cells in the body that remain in us as identifiable cells through our life, even those cells are continually changing the molecules they're made up for. So we can know that there's nothing in that earlier child that's in you, and yet you know that's you. So what is it that connects you? Speaking of identity, the answer is it's the Li. It's the principles by which those different molecules and cells related to each other that actually stayed stable and are your true sense of identity rather than the stuff itself. But then once you start to realize that deeply, and you realize that those principles don't just apply to those cells interacting with each other, but also to your own consciousness interacting with others around you and interacting with all of life around you as a result of what came before you and how you are connected similarly to what comes after you. We suddenly see ourselves as essentially just little eddies in this kind of flow that is so much bigger than us, which invites us to really expand our identity in a way that, as you say, is not available to our sort of modern worldview.
I'm hearing Li being defined as a bunch of different things, which is good because I think it's a very new concept for most listeners. Even if you don't have actual memories of when you were a child,
Right.
you have an autobiographical narrative that has connected the timeline.
That's right.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the autobiographical narrative in and of itself is one of the principles of Li for humans
Yes.
in order for humans to have follow through with a coherent story about who they
Yes.
are.
Beautifully said. Yes, that's precisely where I'm going. In the book, actually, I explore another key concept that comes from systems thinking, which is really another way of looking at how modern science looks at what the Li actually is. And the concept is the concept of attractors. And an attractor is a relatively new term for people who may not be familiar with systems thinking. An attractor simply relates to the pattern of flow in which a complex system retains some sense of consistency and persistence, you will. A simple way of looking at an attractor, just if you like turn the water on in your sink and you just look at the pattern of how the water like squiggles around before it goes down the drain, that's an attractor. When we apply that to our patterns of consciousness within ourselves, we can see that we actually create our own attractors of consciousness. We create certain patterns which can be identified literally in terms of patterns of neural firing, where neurons that fire together wire together and therefore get stronger in their neural firing. And then we can recognize that that applies not just to the literal nervous system, but our experience of consciousness, that those neural firings follow into patterns of ways in which we relate to our own experience that then gets to become solidified somewhat within our field of consciousness. We can see this happening on a fractal layer. So momentary reactions to something are like moment to moment emotions or qualia. Then those might solidify a little stronger into a mood. And that mood might stay a while and become more of a state. And ultimately, over a number of years, if that state keeps staying in that same attractor, can become who we are, like our personality. But so we see these principles of fractality and attractors, systems concepts applying to our very sense of identity that relates to actually some of the most profound Buddhist or Confucian teachings about the Li.
Yes, and also about transformation.
Right, exactly. There's so many debates in modern psychology. Are we fixed in our level of well-being? And there's not really much we can do to make ourselves happier or unhappier, or things like that. And when we look at systems understandings, we recognize that no matter how resilient certain attractors are, they undergo occasional phase transitions to a completely different states. And that is key. And that is both frightening if we think about things like our civilization or the climate. And it's also amazingly liberating when we think about things like the process toward awakening or the desire to transform elements within ourselves that cause us suffering, that they're not necessarily fixed, that even though they might repeat themselves, so much so that they feel like we can never get beyond them, we have the ability by using intentionality and using practices to actually rework those attractors of consciousness to the point that there is this potential for an actual phase transition.
Those of us who work with people all day long, we are always in the presence of the surprising nature of how spontaneously a phase transition can occur without a kind of deliberateness on the part of either party in the room. It's always a third thing that emerges. And of course, emergence, I think, is also one of the properties of Li.
That's completely right. Emergence is one category of phase transition, and that emergence can happen when a system is in a particular state. And as a result of oftentimes greater complexity or greater energy coming into the system with increased complexity, it can emerge into a fundamentally different state, just in the same way that a chrysalis emerges into a butterfly. And in fact, life itself has now been understood as a process of emergence. The very beginning of life on Earth, billions of years ago, resulting as a state of complex chemicals working together in a self-organized way, and doing so to create what's called autopoiesis, essentially self-creation, where suddenly the state actually begins to create itself or keep recreating itself by metabolizing. So emergence is a very, very powerful concept there.
To kind of tie up this little section about self and I, self organizing, self emerging, these terms are, for me, a guidepost to what your book is most asking people to embrace, which is we've been walking around with a very limited notion of what self is. It's an entity inside of a human's head.
That's right.
But you're asking people to widen the view. The word self can actually be applied to communities, it can be applied to organisms, and there isn't really something special about our particular species and the way we do life.
Yes, beautifully summarized, Lisa. Sometimes I find it easier to kind of focus on using the word identity. That word self somehow has a way of getting so incredibly confusing because it's used in so many different ways. And then if we think about identity, we can think in terms of actually our identity itself being fractal. I've been talking a lot about this notion of fractality. My own sense is that it's not that we have to relinquish permanently or in some absolute way that sense of ourself as a bounded ego, myself being a body, and the recognition that something hits me, it'll hurt, I'll experience that. I do have that separate existence. I also have an identity of expanding out. Like, can I expand at one level out to those I'm very close with, a sense of shared identity with family and very close friends. It can expand out to community, identifying with my community. That can be both my local regional community. It can be a community of people with shared ideas. It can expand out to being a sense of identity with an ideology. And if I have a religion that means a lot to me, I can share that sense of selfhood or identity with all people who share that, or even a nation. And it can expand to all of humanity. And then ultimately it can expand to all of life. That place of expanding to all of life, or even all of the universe, which can lead to that sense of emptiness and that sense of timelessness, each of those has incredible value. And it's not that one is so valuable, we need to relinquish the others. But what I think is available to us is to establish pathways of shifting fractally and seamlessly and harmoniously from different levels of that fractal identity, depending on what's called for at one moment in time, and depending on where we are in our life, on our own life cycles as an organism. So I think that's what's incredibly important, is recognizing that identity can be and is fractal, rather than having to be focused on trying to get to that greater sense of identity and relinquish the smaller layers or whatever, is actually to celebrate each of them in this process of integration. People like Dan Siegel will define as things like unity with differentiation. And similarly, each of those fractal layers can be celebrated for what they are as part of the greater unfolding of the sort of ultimate Li of existence, if you will.
Listeners might be at this point saying, wow, this is all really profound and it's really amazing. And we are careening toward a disaster. The great thing about the web of meaning is that it is focused on, yes, we're careening toward a disaster, and let's actually talk practically about what we can do. A really good way to enter into that conversation, if it's okay if we enter into that conversation.
Absolutely.
You actually brought up something I'd never heard of. Modern civilization is caught in a Wendigo psychosis, which basically is consuming the earth at an unsustainable pace, which we all know. But you essentially connect up a sense of delirium. And, delirium has two aspects to it. Usually, delirium's very speedy and it's extremely distorted. So you can't slow down to actually understand anything. And your conception about the way things are is very far away from where it really is.
Right.
So I thought we could start by having you really talk about Wendigo psychosis and how it's driving the inability for so many people right now to really get where we are.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. This notion of Wendigo, the person who best expressed it is actually Robin Wall Kimmerer, an amazing Native American indigenous person who's also a biologist who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. And she talks about how the Ojibwe children in earlier times would be told about this Wendigo monster so that they would get terrified of. And it was a monster that actually had this heart of ice. He was absolutely in this place of he had to devour everything he could. He was always hungry. And if he found a human, he would want to devour that human. But here was the catch, that if you caught a human and he bite the human didn't die, but the human turned into one of these Wendigo monsters themselves and would then have this horrible, like always having to always eat more, just in this place of delirium, just as you described. Actually, this is an incredibly powerful metaphor for exactly what began in Europe around the time of the scientific revolution, when people began to see themselves as separate from nature. It's actually no coincidence that that new way of thinking arose out of the same time and place that capitalism itself arose out of, and that colonialism itself arose out of. There was this fundamental drive people had to say, we can just exploit as much as possible. That's not just, not bad to do, but it's actually what we're meant to do. And they would find ways to justify that. And that led to basically those Western European powers taking over the world militarily, and this logic of capitalism, which is all about growing earnings, exploiting as fast as possible, creating corporations whose sole reason to be is to just increase profits as fast as possible, exploit as much as possible and as quickly as you can. And that's what we're in the throes of right now. And so that's basically what the Wendigo monster looks like in the modern world. And it is something that once it grabs hold of you, turns people into being part of that monster. And I'm not saying that people themselves are the monsters, but that energy is this monstrous energy that really can take hold of all of us in different ways. You've got to be part of this treadmill, this hedonic treadmill that just pushes us faster and faster. The recognition of that is one of the first things we need to do if we want to try to turn it around, because we can't actually stop that or redirect it unless we become aware of it.
Like hungry ghosts in the Buddhist tradition, right? So,
Yes,
which
exactly.
means every tradition has a way to explain greed off the hook in human life. And I wouldn't necessarily say what you're describing is only modern. I wouldn't say that that's the case, because you could look back at feudal societies, essentially, which were from a very long time ago. All the wealth and the power was centralized with a very small group of people who were insatiable and really thought of everybody else as slaves to their insatiability.
That's completely true. I would look at the rise of settled agrarian communities about 10,000 years ago for where we
Yeah.
can see the beginning of that, along with the rise in patriarchy and hierarchies and all that stuff. But I do think what we have to recognize is that since that period in the 17th century or so, that became not just something that a small wealthy elite sort of lived according to at the expense of others around us. That became the foundational value system for the very world in which we live. And that became the foundational system for neoliberalism, where we're told there is no such thing as society. There's just individuals who are selfish, greedy, rational, maximizers for themselves. And the way the system really works best is if we have as little regulation as possible and just let everyone get on with their selfishness. And actually, that free market's the way that that can happen. And so we just got this ideology that has now become drummed into the way our world works, which is not just driving us to disaster, but it's just wrong on almost every single basis of it is scientifically and ontologically flawed.
Yes, I think a great example of this is NFTs.
Yeah, you want to say more about?
It really is a Wendigo psychosis, honestly. There is nothing useful and nothing virtuous about anything that is created in an NFT, whether it's visual, whether it's a tweet, It's ridiculous. And yet,
Yes.
this is now the way people think they should make money.
Yes, yeah. All of these things are symptoms of this increasing drive of our society towards this fragmentation and towards really commercializing everything into some sense of monetization. One of the things that I find so incredibly disturbing is the way that nature itself is now talked about as valuing ecosystem services. Ironically, this is an idea that was developed by really thoughtful, progressive environmentalists some decades ago, tearing their hair out about how they couldn't get business people or governments to care about nature. So they said, I got an idea. Try to get them to realize that nature has value. So if they're untrammeled selfishness, at least if they recognize nature has value, then they'll account that for that. And so they won't want to destroy their own. So after decades, it's now become understood throughout UN organizations and almost every company that has that any involvement with environmental issues talks about, yeah, we need to value nature, this natural capital. So what they've basically done is taken what is this thing with intrinsic value, life itself, and they've said, well, our monetary system is bigger than that. So we just have to incorporate it in it. It's almost like merger and acquisition of nature into the monetary system. And that has terrible consequences because well, it might seem incrementally a positive thing. Well, good. So these companies realize that mangrove swamp has value. But then they say, well, that mangrove swamp does all of these good things for biodiversity and it helps with channeling rainwater, et cetera. Let's put a value of $200 million on that. But if we drained it and actually built a resort and a factory and all this kind of stuff, well, that would be worth $400 million. We've incorporated the value of nature in that, and we've made a good financial decision now. And what's even worse, as something degrades, like coral reefs, as they get sick from acidification of the ocean and they get bleaching events and they get to be less effective in what they're doing, their value goes down according to that. So as soon as their value goes down, it becomes more acceptable to just destroy the rest of them. So it's completely backwards logic, which has now become inculcated in normal mainstream institutional thinking about how to value nature. You'll see UN agencies proud of talking about their valuation of nature.
Completely the wrong-headed view of what it is we want to actually have happen. So there's one more thing we need to talk about before we talk about revisioning the way we live, how we ingest, and all of that. And that is this other argument. Okay, you people in the West, you've had all this amazing stuff for decades now, and you've lived this very entitled, great life. And now those of us in what used to be third world economies, which frankly now are quickly becoming the first world, and maybe we're becoming the third world, they have such desire. The Wendigo psychosis is huge because they basically were prevented from having all of the modern conveniences that we have grown accustomed to and take for granted. So there's the argument, now you want us to start conserving? You don't want us to have cars, but you've had it for so long.
Yes, and that's all completely true. The privilege that those of us have here in the global north, where maybe roughly 20% of the human population has roughly 80% of the wealth and actually has caused that same rough 70 to 80% of emissions and pollution on the earth. Our privilege actually is a direct result of that colonialist extraction that has been taking place for centuries. It's not like something that just happened in the past. We tend to think of the rich countries in the global north as giving these donations of 1% of their GDP in developmental aid to these impoverished countries in the south, whatever it might be. Actually, the flows of money go the other way. Over $1 trillion of wealth every year flows from the global south to the global north, not in the other direction. So even now, this is taking place. It's absolutely true that when we look at what needs to be done to transform the direction of growth-based global society is moving on, those of us in the global north have to realize we are causing the vast bulk of the destruction that's taking place. And we have to be ready to re-envision our lives and not expect others to do something without ourselves making the most drastic changes. There actually is enough food and enough wealth in the world right now to allow all 8 billion of us human beings to live a flourishing and healthy life. What there isn't enough for is for the incredible inequalities we have right now, where it's hard to believe, but just the wealthiest 26 billionaires own as much wealth as half of the entire human population, about 4 billion people.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of inequality that is just unacceptable. And it flows down. So it's not just those billionaires, but those of us who live these elite lifestyles. We're driven by a need to look at how we can actually shift. I'm not talking about reducing the quality of our lives. I'm actually talking about increasing the quality and the well-being of our lives by moving away from the materialist consumer culture that is part of this Wendigo hedonic treadmill that takes away from our well-being. But we can actually make shifts that move towards well-being and away from consumerism and actually use less stuff, even while the quality of our lives can actually improve significantly, not in spite of, but oftentimes because of those changes.
Let's talk about shift. How in the world do we do this?
The shift that needs to take place is at a very deep level. If you read the news from one day to the next, we see the negative things about the greater inequality, new problems, whatever it might be each day about climate breakdown. And we see the positives, like, oh, the cost of renewals are coming down or incremental improvements taking place. Those are good things, and I don't want to diminish their value. But we need to see that the changes that have to take place, they have to happen at the foundational worldview level of our society. Think of it almost like imagining a software system that's gone awry and the bugs just keep getting worse and worse. And you have like hundreds of professional bug fixers saying, well, here's a workaround. Oh, this workaround causes a bigger problem over here. But okay, well, let's get more people to look at that workaround. Quick, we need to work on it right away. And then somebody comes along and says, actually, you know what? We need to change the operating system. People say, oh, but we don't have time for that. But like, there's all these workarounds we've got to do. We do need to do those workarounds, and we have to shift the operating system too and ultimately transition to a new one. And if we apply that logic to our society, the operating system of our society is this worldview of wealth accumulation that says everything is based on separateness, selfishness, extraction, exploiting other things around. The operating system that we need to change to is one that actually is based on the principles of life itself, which some people, and I've sort of joined the chorus, it certainly wasn't my term, but I love this term, an ecological civilization. So actually changing the fundamentals of our civilization to one that is actually life affirming, one that actually looks at the principles that allows ecosystems to be healthy and resilient for millions of years sometimes, and says, how can those principles then be applied to human society to allow that same kind of long-term flourishing for us?
Well, interdependence, of course, would say in order to make that happen, there would have to be a way to make that happen internally inside of the individuals who make up the society.
That is completely right. At the same time, I think it's helpful to look at it from the point of view of the different layers that need to be transformed with each other. You have like an activist saying, we got to change society first. We don't have time to like go through all this individual transformation. That'll follow. And meanwhile, they might be taking their own colonized consciousness and their own dukkha and applying that in the very changes they're trying to do. And on the other side, you have all kinds of people saying, no, we have to begin within ourselves. Let me work on my own inner transformation. And then once I've gotten to that place, I can go and re-engage with all the messy stuff, the politics and the social stuff. My strong feeling about all that, coming from this notion of the web of meaning, each of those transformations don't just need to take place at the same time, but they actually depend on each other for the transformation to be truly authentic, to be truly integrated. I'm not going to decolonize my own consciousness, basically. I'm not going to transform myself without having that flow through to my engagement with others and my recognition of my role in the whole world system. And similarly, there's changes in the global world system. I'm not going to even have any positive impact on having them happen unless I'm working on these changes within myself and with our community. So it's almost like we can imagine three levels of scales: identity, self-identity, community, and global systemic. And each of those things, just like I was talking before about fractal layers of identity, there's like these fractal layers of engagement, each of which has to be working in a harmonious way with the other.
It's very frustrating, you know. There's this utter delusion that is so intense now. There doesn't even seem to be a common agreement about what is true
Yes.
at any of those three levels. It's as though we've become inured to distortions and lies, so much so that no one is willing to have some kind of shared agreement about what is wise and what is not, which didn't seem to be the case in some of the traditions like Taoism and Buddhism that you've been talking about, even in the indigenous world view. You know, there was a shared set of principles based on shared experience. This just seems to be
Yes.
gone.
We are experiencing that. A lot of that arises from a combination of the technological shifts, of course, where social media has allowed that to happen so much more than ever in the past, driven by underlying capitalist drivers, which ultimately say to these big social media companies, make as much money as possible. And yeah, it's been shown categorically that statements that are untrue go viral to a far greater degree than those that are true. These companies, they're not necessarily people trying to do bad, but if they're simply following their directive to make as much profit as possible, will do everything to actually encourage the virality of those things that lead to more advertising dollars. There are multiple shifts taking place because while there is this disintegration, if you will, there's also at the same time increasing numbers of people sharing that greater sense of shared humanity and shared identity with life. You see examples. We saw horrendous activities last year around the racist murders that would take place, and all through the world within a day or two people would be caring, even if they were completely different countries, because they recognize there's something wrong here. When Greta Thunberg sits there for days at a time outside the Swedish parliament, sitting all by herself, there's this sense of shared caring about these values that suddenly flows through the whole world, so that within a year or two, you have millions of school children going on a climate strike inspired by her. And there's both a sense of this fragmentation of realities and an incredible power of the deep connectivity that people are feeling around realities. And that's where I feel so much of what we can each of us can do is to try to stay very true to those core values that we know we share with other human beings, even when those other human beings act as if they are completely against those values. Those values caring about life, caring about love, caring about deep connectivity, that when we see people acting in ways that are very different from that, recognizing that it's not actually because they want to destroy things, and it's because of the deep suffering that they are undergoing as a result of the conditioning that they've been experiencing through this Wendigo system and through these incredible extreme inequalities that have been forced on them and their society.
Connecting with a secular set of values that is non-harming and somehow life-affirming.
Yes, there's this wonderful quote by Albert Schweitzer, the great humanitarian of the 20th century, who made the statement. He just basically said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. Based on that, he says, for this reason, I cannot but have reverence for all that lives around me. To me, that is one of the simplest and most powerful foundations for looking at a sense of values. One of the areas I look in the book, I have a section entitled, How Should I Live? Which looks at all the different ways in which value systems have changed over the millennia. It doesn't take this kind of postmodernist stance of saying, well, there is no right and wrong, and whatever value system has its own sense of autonomy or whatever, but it looks at that basis of life once again to give us the inspiration for a value system that actually is truly life affirming and that leads to known sometimes as the ecological self, the sense of being a self as part of in ecosystems, part of all of life around us. When we try to form our values from that basis, it's not like everything becomes clear. There's still always trade-offs to make, but it gives a real solid foundation for then building a better understanding of how we should actually live.
So it seems like sacrifice has something to do with all of this. I know people don't like to talk about sacrifice because, honestly, Wendigo psychosis means you never have to sacrifice. You can have everything whenever you want it.
When I think about what we might need to sacrifice, I look back at the actual etymology of that word sacrifice, because it's really interesting, because it actually comes from the Latin and Greek that essentially means to make something sacred. If we then start to take away this sacrifice from the way it's kind of used in this kind of our hedonic treadmill, oh, sacrifice means I have to buy a cheaper, smaller car that doesn't ride as well. Sacrifice means I have to move to a smaller condominium. Forget that. That's how we tend to think of sacrifice in the way it's used in our terms nowadays. But if we think about starting from that place of making sacred, we go, well, what is sacred to me? Ultimately, a lot of us end up with it from a similar place. Ultimately, it comes down to life is sacred, and those we love are sacred. The earth is sacred. There are certain things that we don't mess with. There are certain things that we don't make compromises about. And if we start on that basis and then say, now, how can I live in order that my life is making those things sacred through the actions I take? It's a whole different story. And then that word sacrifice is no longer about what do I need to give up in order to say that I've done my bit. How can I be living in a way that each moment, each event that I do, each action I take feels like it's part of my unfolding of really being in devotion to what is truly sacred in my life?
So that means recognizing sacredness is dependent upon reverence. They
Right.
have a relationship with each other. You really can't appreciate what is sacred unless you know what to revere, how to revere something. You know, I'm getting goosebumps. When I read your book, I didn't get goosebumps, but in this conversation that you and I are having, I'm realizing when two humans get together and they begin to talk about these underlying fundamental ways of enacting life as a human, that leads to a feeling that is what humans really want. And
Yes.
what is so devoid in most moments of modern humans' lives, because
Yes.
we live in the midst of devaluation all the time.
Yes. I think that is just so true. When we look at the way our modern world conditions us, it's as if this whole consumer world that we live in is really like one gigantic dukkha machine. It's actually designed to make people dissatisfied with everything as much as possible from one moment to the next. It's designed so that as soon as we work hard to save money to buy something, the advertising and the status of other people around us makes us want the next thing on this hedonic treadmill. That leads to this very important distinction. It was really Aristotle who first made this distinction that modern positive psychology has looked at quite deeply. There's this distinction between hedonia and eudaimonia. And when we talk about the hedonic treadmill, this idea like you get stuck in this thing and just keep wanting more and more things that satisfy you very temporarily. Hedonia doesn't just refer to this kind of notion of hedonism, the way the term is used more popularly, but it really refers to anything that gives us this kind of short-term meeting a need. Eudaimonia can be translated as really like true sustainable well-being, which is allowing each human to actually be living their lives truly fulfilling their deepest potential as a human mind-body organism in wherever it is that they are embedded and what their part is with that greater system they're part of. What the book is about is to show that once we recognize the destructiveness of what our modern society is doing to us as individuals as well as to the rest of life on earth, it's a liberation because we can actually decide to move to a path of well-being, let go of that dukkha machine. Long-term sustainable well-being is actually a path towards sustainable well-being, not just for ourselves, but for all the different fractal layers in which we're embedded. What I call actually in the book, fractal flourishing. The flourishing doesn't take place just at one layer, but it takes place through all the different layers, relating, resonating with each other in a healthy way.
Which is interdependence.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is ultimately the nature of interdependence. Can you recognize when you view yourself as a solid, separate entity, that view is devoid of the richness of the way all things arise, exist, and pass away simultaneously? This is why emptiness is not nothingness.
Right.
In this
Exactly.
sense, emptiness is everythingness from the point of view of everything is there and nothing is graspable.
Yes, I love that way that you just defined it. When I'm in deep meditation, I sort of conceive it almost like a sense of the fractal unfolding of reality, just one wave after another wave of this fractal unfolding of the universe, which you can be with each of those qualia, each moment to moment existence of that. And as soon as you're with it, you can let it go and let the next unfold. And that's where I think you're completely right, that emptiness is most definitely not nothingness, which is why that debate that I was mentioning that took place in China 1,000 years ago, I found so fascinating, because ultimately I think it was more to do with getting confused on terms than anything else, because it's not about emptiness being nothingness. It's about emptiness really being fullness, the true fullness of that fractal unfolding of existence.
Yes, and an embrace of that fractal unfolding, in fact, is the antidote to the feeling of emptiness that most people
Right.
have in their modern,
That's right.
self absorbed existences.
Exactly. Exactly.
What a gift this book is. And I really can't emphasize enough that it's not only readable and understandable, but it's practical philosophy, which means it's enactable. It's not
Mm,
something you read and you say, oh, well, that sounds great. How the hell do I do this
mm,
thing? You didn't set out to do an instruction manual. However, it is an instruction manual for revisioning. And I think that that's a critical piece for us right now because
mm.
we're so lost. And I see this every day in my office when people come in and they're so lost to themselves, in
Yes.
that they are lost to the essence of who they are as a human.
Right. That recognition of that lostness is the first step towards finding a path to finding oneself again.
As the Mahamudra tradition would say, not finding is the best finding, but
Right.
you have to find before you can not find.
Exactly. Because finding ultimately is that fractal unfolding, and just not trying to make a place, not trying to set
Yes.
aside some territory, but actually just going with that unfolding flow.
The finding of the ungraspable becomes the not finding,
Yes,
in that you're unwinding the incessant need, the obsession with grasping.
that's right.
So, okay, is there anything we have not talked about that really needs to be said?
Well, I feel we've covered just an amazing array of, of topics, Lisa, and I thank you for just the reflective way in which you've led us through so much of what the book is about. So thank you. Really appreciated that.
Yes, we're coming out of our COVID caves. Does this mean that people can maybe have you sign a book or see you speak, or is it all going to be online?
Well, still, the vast bulk of what I'm doing is offered online, but there are a number of events that are taking place online. So, what I would just do is point people actually toward my website, which is just very simply jeremylent.com, all one word. You'll see a calendar at one of the top choices on the menu there. You'll be able to see events that are coming up shortly there. And I'd love to see people at those. And even though it might not be in person, one of the wonderful things about that has happened after COVID is that we just get these incredible global communities arising where we just get on a Zoom call and people from all around the world get to just be part of the conversation, ask questions, and I look forward to that.
Yes. Jeremy, this has been so moving.
Well, thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.